And welcome back to another episode of Building the Board. My name is Quentin Crisco. I'm joined by a very special guest tonight, Dr. Mason West. Mason, how are you doing this evening?
Not too shabby at all. It's cool to be on this side of it after a little while. I've been hosting, my own pod for the last year and a half or so. It's cool to just sit back and, get to chill and spout knowledge instead of having to run all the strings behind the scenes.
Right, it's such a different seat, different job when you're just able to show up as a guest and be like, "Yeah, we're just gonna talk." That's easy. Like I don't have to plan it. I don't have to figure out the conversation, the flow. It's nice. But let's get into what we're talking about tonight. We're talking draft prospects. That's what this whole thing is, building the board. We're trying to build the Chicago Bears draft board. And Mason, I think you bring a very unique perspective to a lot of this stuff, being a doctor of physical therapy. Is that right?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, doctor of physical therapy. You see stuff in the way people move, in their body movements, their movement traits, their injuries potentially, that a lot of us don't see and don't fully understand. So what we're trying to do is we're going to talk through a few position groups and a few players in those position groups that the Bears might consider that might make sense for the Bears, and say, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in their movement traits? What are you seeing in their injury history? And what's kind of the general vibe? But we want to start each position with saying, what do you look for in movement traits, and trying to put it in explain like I'm 5 years old terms. Like, what does it mean when I'm reading a scout report? It says stiff hips. It says great bend. Like I feel like there's a lot of terms in scouting that get kind of confused, or can get confusing into the layman terms and get kind of contorted in people's minds of what it actually means. And it might mean something different to everyone else. But let's start this off with offensive line. And on that sentiment, Mason, like what are you looking for when you flip on an offensive tackle tape for those movement traits that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at offensive line, like you just kind of alluded to, right, you're going to have differences in some of those positions, center versus guard, guard versus tackle. I mean, when it comes to tackle, everyone talks about length. And yes, length is very important. At the end of the day, if you can keep the defender at bay, that solves a good number of problems. But when I'm looking at offensive tackles in particular, it's not just how long you are, torso, on arms, and everything like that. But, those movement skills are so important. So in particular with tackles, a lot of times for me, it's about how well you can move the upper body and lower body in, but also out of sync. So we used to call that, like, especially out of sync, that'd be dissociation. So, if you have your lower pelvis, legs, hip bones, etc., rotated, let's say slightly to the left, let's say you're playing left tackle, slightly to the left, and now all of a sudden you have an edge defender that's trying to dip and rip underneath you and cut inside. Well, how can you now rotate through your upper body, right? Get contact with those long arms, hopefully have the same amount and have the same kind of power like you would if you had your pelvis to the right place, right? Because you want to be square up. But at the end of the day, that's not sport. It's not going to happen all the time. So it's all well and good when the situation's perfect, hips, torso, all that are locked in place. But what happens ultimately when you have to dissociate and now you have to be rotated where you don't want to be rotated? And then what about what's going on with the feet, right? I mean, you talk about fast feet and all that's well and good, but can your feet be either A, stacked under you? And if they can't be stacked under you, right, do you have the appropriate athleticism? And everyone defines athleticism a little differently. I know my personal definition, that's what I use with my high-level athletes, is ability to complete the same task in a variety of different ways, but with the same amount of efficiency. So can you, right, like have your foot and hip rotated 5 degrees out from what you would normally have it, or because that's what the situation dictated, 5 degrees in, and you still can create the same amount of stability and power out of that position. So, some of the tackles that don't end up working out, because maybe they do have all the lengths in the world that you want, but you just don't have the fluidity and stability and ability to operate in these different kind of planes that some of the higher level tackles can.
Yeah, and I love that, because that's such a hard thing for me to define when I'm writing reports, when I'm watching tape, talking on a podcast about it. But like for offensive line and offensive tackles in particular, something that I've always kind of defined it as the ability to generate power from awkward positions
Yeah,
is something that
100%.
like I'm looking for, but I don't know the mechanics of it. I don't know the details like you just went through. I just know that guy doesn't look like he should be able to do that from that position, and he just did it, you know.
Yeah, it's funny when you look at it from it's a gift and a curse. I always joke because it doesn't matter if I'm watching, an NFL tape or college tape or I'm sitting at a beer fest. I always just am looking at the musculoskeletal and what's going on biomechanically. But when it comes specifically to, an offensive lineman tackle in particular, it's how well can you operate awkwardly and make it not look awkward?
Hmm.
There's guys that do that very, very well. And, they make defenders look silly because of it. The defender hits a move that should work, 9 times out of 10, but because the tackle was able to generate the same amount of power and was then able to, we always talk about recovery too, right? It's not just being in that weird position, but can you now get back to
Hmm.
a more traditional position? And how that's another layer of it as well.
Yeah. And so, Mason, if I were an offensive tackle, I'm going like, man, I'm really having trouble, like you described, being able to get my body turned back to the right and be able to actually generate power back there. Like, how would you train someone like that who's really trying to focus in on that area?
So, trying to start from base, like building block, and then going upward. First and foremost, you just have the prerequisite mobility needs that we have that I would like of you in all the different parts, right? So, we're going to look at, do you have hip internal and external rotation? And so, what's important for hip rotation is that not only do you want symmetry between, like, let's say, left and right hip, right? Like, so you want somewhere around 30-ish degrees of hip external rotation, left and right. You want some symmetry within hip internal and external on the same side, too. So, a lot of times you end up seeing situations where you're limited in internal rotation on one hip, your external is great. And so now all of a sudden you don't even have that range available to you to be even awkward in, right? You hit that hard wall. And what ends up happening is you try to get it from somewhere else. So now all of a sudden you try to cheat and try to steal it from down lower in the knee or the ankle, or oftentimes with offensive line, in all reality, it's now in the upper torso. And that's where you start to lose some power. And that's also where you can get some various injuries. Now, let's say you have the prerequisite range of motion and we've worked on that, or, we've achieved that. Well, now how do you translate that in terms of, well, can your pelvis be stable, right? You're using that range, which is fantastic. But now you can take that upper block, that thoracic spine,
Mhm.
let's say, and now rotate in those directions. So if I was someone who wanted to work on that, it seems a little simple, but that's what you just do it. You just do it in various positions, and you want to work where you're over analytical a little bit. Like, hey, how much did I let this lower half move when I'm trying to keep it stable versus the upper half? And then once you get the general control of it, now you can load it. Right now, all of a sudden, you can use there's a variety of ways, like some of the fancier ways, and we saw this in quarterback, with Patrick Mahomes using the Proteus device where you can rip through and do rotational work with that. Like, that's high level kind of stuff. You can do it low level too, cable machines, things like that. Just how much power can you really generate? I like Kaisers. There are these air based ones that you're not gonna have slamming weights, and plus you can see maximally how much output you're getting. But now, how much power can you generate into that rotation? And what a lot of people don't realize now is, in the best case scenarios, you are training for symmetry on both sides. So even though you're a left tackle, and normally, right, the edge rusher is going to be, running up your left side, can you still move and do the exact opposite? So I take this with, for example, my baseball players. They're a right-handed baseball player. I'm going to have you try to do the mechanics of if you were going to throw lefty, because that's going to mean you have the balance, right, to be able to balance out the other position, the other mechanic that you're doing. And ultimately, that's what a lot of these linemen do. It's just about how, like, to what extent, and is their trainer, their therapist, whoever's working with them doing it the same way. So yeah, we're really going from what's happening at that biomechanical level with the actual range of motion, the firing from brain to muscle, how the timing of it all. That's the whole other conversation, right? Guys who are being asked to move from tackle to guard, or from one guard to the other guard, vice versa. Like, what does all that look like? That's a whole other sidebar. But then, and then also ultimately now how you're able to transfer that force that you're generating in the lower body, because you want at least 50% of it. Guys who have heavy hands, more often than not, they should either do or should have pretty strong legs, and how you transfer that from leg into the hands.
Now, that's really interesting to me from the aspect of, because like you see people ask all the time, how hard is it to move from left side to right side or right side to left side? And as you're saying this, I'm thinking like, so if there's a guy who played all high school right tackle, all college right tackle, how I don't want to say how likely, because we like it's hard to say how likely, but like would it be reasonable to say that it's possible that the guy might be kind of under um flexible to one side of his body versus the other, and that could create restraints on him switching sides?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to boil down at a minimum to that, right? Like, do you have the prerequisite mobility requirements to do the movement that you need? Think about a tackle, right? The primary thing everyone thinks about is that initial slide. So,
Mhm.
do you even have that in your arsenal? Because if you don't, then to ask him now, hey, slide now the other direction. I mean, what if he's limited by 60%? That first step, you're going to get beat over and over and over again. And it takes time to get mobility. Like, that's why no one does it, because mobility training takes forever. You do it every day, you do it for weeks, months at a time, and you could get incremental gains. And so that, I mean, that's just the first part. Now, once you have, and so the example I always give people is if you clasp your hands together, right, you got to have one thumb on top. Now, unclasp it and do it so your other thumb is on top. It feels weird as hell. You're like, this is a totally different position, but it's really not, right? It's just the opposite. Now, take that and extrapolate it, not just with a simple clasp with the hands, but the entire body and how it's working in sync, ankle up to the top of the head. So, A, yes, getting the prerequisite movement pattern, but then B, being able to over time and just rep over and over and over again. I mean, you have to do it 100,000 times perfectly to become an expert in that pattern. And do you have the time to do that? You know, a lot of these guys,
Right.
they get drafted. Hey, you're a right tackle, but I think you can play left tackle. Can you get 100,000 reps, but before it's week one? I don't think so.
Yeah, interesting. So, talking a little bit about actual prospects, about individual players,
Sure.
and we talked a little before this, and you gave me some players that you might be interested in talking about. And one of the first that jumps out to me, that's a big name for the Bears to consider here, is Will Campbell. So, what do you see in Will Campbell's movement profile that is interesting, limiting, anything, all of the above?
So I don't know what his arms are going to measure, and I don't really care, to be honest. For two reasons. A, if he is under that 33-inch threshold, I think it's going to be barely, right? I think the person with the measuring tape is going to be like, oh no, you're at 30. It's going to be barely there. And also B, because his foot speed, his control, his hip range of motion allow for him to keep his body in front of those long armed edges. He's a really natural knee bender, and by all that, you can usually tell when people do a squat or even like as a tackle with like kind of that mini squat, how fluidly does that lower leg bone, that tibia, want to translate forward, how well the glutes, the hips want to push backward. Some people get there and they kind of force it. He just sinks into it, right? It's very fluid. It's very easy for him. He doesn't have to get more of that bend elsewhere, like for example, up into the low back area, like a lot of people might have to. And
So when you're talking that, is that almost like some ankle flexion too that comes in next? You're saying with the almost the knee moving forward as you're bending down, as opposed to like going backwards right into a squat kind of
that's going to be a
position?
part of that for sure, right? Because at the end of the day, yeah, in order for that, like I said, lower leg bone and tibia to actually translate forward over the toe in a way, that's really ankle. That's ankle dorsiflexion, how well you can bend that ankle upward. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just that it triggered the thought in my mind, so I figured ask it while you're still talking it.
No, excellent question. I also just see for him that he's able shows the agility to scramble and recover, and ultimately, if a long arm defender does get a stab in his chest, because that's the concern, right? Everyone
Mhm.
remembers the Khalil Mack stab to the chest and just throwing that
It's
who was it
exactly what I
Wirfs.
think of. Yeah.
And so you're worried about that if he's a bit shorter arm. But I think for him, he's also strong enough, and you see through his core that he doesn't get blown back. That's that hyperextension, chest is flailed forward and up. That doesn't really happen to him because he's just so solid in that core, and he's able to transfer that force from chest through core down into the ground and boom, lock into place. So I'm just not as worried about that with him.
Okay. Interesting. Now, would you say that that is a something that translates well? Because I always wonder about this, and I don't have a good answer for it. But I feel like like being able to anchor at tackle is a very different thing than anchoring at guard, because when you're at tackle, You have time to read. You have time to prepare yourself a little. But at guard, no one's wide nine, right? Like no one's giving you space to see it coming. It's just boom, they're right on you.
Yeah.
Does that thought process change at all at guard with his ability to still kind of sit down in that anchor and be able to transfer that force from his upper body down into the ground and reset?
Yeah, it's definitely different because, like you're saying, it just happens so much quicker, and you have a little less room for error. And we see that all the time, right? When a guard or a center even loses inside, I mean, it is immediate and it's bad. For a tackle, you have that moment where either you can adjust to the oncoming rusher, or because the distance to the quarterback's a bit greater, you can adjust while you are still in contact with that defender to, whether you're trying to whip them around the outside, whether you're trying to like crush them down inward just to create a new edge. There's just more opportunity there. So as a guard, obviously it would have shifted in recent times, but for a while it was always tackles are the bright, shiny, fun things, and the guards are just the big maulers that don't get paid a lot, don't get respected. I think that honestly, guard though, the natural reaction, just the almost like reflex that you need to have, is much greater demand.
Okay, I think that's something that I don't know. It's hard to look at Campbell's tape and really figure that out, but I feel like a lot of times, and this is getting away from body mechanics and more to mental aspects, but I feel like that type of stuff is kind of either you have it or you don't. It's like it's almost like I don't want to say fight or flight, because flight implies that you're running away.
Yeah,
But like a fight, a react or like pause mentality, where I think I see plenty of reaction like instantly in his tape, where I go, yeah, I think he can make that switch. But ultimately, I mean, me just being watching the tape and from a non-biomechanical standpoint, I think he's just going to stay at tackle. Personally, I don't see why you wouldn't. But
yeah, I think you draft him to play tackle. You draft him to play tackle, and then like worst case scenario, at 2 years down the line, you want to, because you're drafting him in the top. He's not making it past the Bears. Let's be real. Let's be real. Like, so let's assume he's being drafted in the top 10. You're saying, how do we salvage this? Okay, let's try him at guard. But I just don't think it'll be a problem for him. I think he's going to be one of those rare cases that maybe teams look back on next year, the year after, where they're like, well, Will Campbell had 32.5-inch arms, so we can make it work with insert whoever in 2026. Because I think he just is this rare combo that can actually make it work.
Yeah, I see a lot of Braden Smith in his tape. And Braden Smith's the guy who has like 32.5-inch arms, who has made it work at right tackle. I think there's a lot of similarities there. But let's move on from Will Campbell. Let's talk about another guy here, a national champion, Donovan Jackson out of Ohio State. And Mason, what do you see with him? He's an interesting prospect.
So it's weird, right? Because he has a guard like prototype body, like thick chest, broad hips, long arms, big hands. So he's just a large individual, not kind of a little bit of the lankiness you might get at a traditional tackle. Jackson shifted right from guard to left tackle when Josh Simmons was lost for the year with the injury. Just that in and of itself is impressive, because being able to make the shift as quickly as he made it too, right? It's not like Simmons got hurt and they had in the summer and they had time to throw all this together. Just to be able to shift that quickly is ridiculous.
His first game, he did get torched by Abdul Carter, but then after that, it was all like really good.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, after a rough start, I mean, it's also Abdul Carter. The guy's probably gonna be a first, maybe second round pick overall, second overall pick. But the rest of the way was really solid, and especially during that playoff run. I think when you look at some of his movement skills, so like last offseason, he timed at a 1.59 10-yard split, a vertical jump of 30 inches, 9.7 in the broad jump. You can just see that there's a lot of explosion there, which is very important. And part of his skill set is the coordination that he has between his upper and lower body. So he can really maintain leverage through contact while driving his feet. You see that through the core power, the hip flexion, and how he can reset his hands. And that's actually much harder than you think. To be able to keep your feet engaged, right? You're continually trying to drive, unengage at the shoulder hand, then trying to re-engage and keep going, right? You lose that anchor point. To have the core strength into the ground to be able to maintain that stability. It's pretty fantastic. And I mean, he just has the athleticism for all the tasks, like an outside zone blocker, able to accelerate, lead the way on long pulls and counters. So, I mean, he just has this profile where, and I think he looked better at tackle than he did at guard. And it's almost just, I think, because he has a little more space to like
Mhm.
freewheel with some of the foot
With
speed that
his
he does have and everything. I think it was
35-inch
almost
long
just like
arms.
a man stuck in a phone booth a little bit at
Yeah.
guard. It's just like, what do I do?
I saw some of the same stuff. I felt like he looked a little robotic and awkward at guard at times and much more natural at tackle. I think he could play either in the league, but um, one thing that you said really caught my ear, and that was with his ability to be able to reset his hands while continuing to move his feet, because that runs almost contrary to one of his negatives that I thought was his run blocking footwork was kind of a mess and tending to stall up at times. But I don't think that is a physical thing. Like, that's probably more a mental thing that I'm seeing. And if you're saying that he can do that physically, that makes me a little higher on him now, because like that means it's in there, right? It's like it's he can stay connected, keep moving those feet. The stalling up is probably more a thought process thing, a maybe a mental block, a change of position, something going on there. But that's something that's promising for me to hear and makes me kind of like him a little more.
The other thing too is, you've seen that he tends to try to do a lot of stuff with his upper extremity. And when he does have some negatives, it's when he's leaning against stunts, slanting fronts. And I think that can even extrapolate a little bit to when he's trying to, maybe pull or in the run game, where he's just like, I have this length because he's a long dude. So
Mhm.
I can get you with this length, because he's just been able to do that his entire, he did it in high school. He was able to do it early in college, but now it's like, as he moves forward, can I truly bring my lower half, which is a good lower half compared to, a lot of other individuals, and really get that in sync? When he does it in sync, it's very impressive. It's just kind of when, I don't want to say lazy. It's just when he's like, well, I've been able to do this forever and just use my arm to get there. Well, no, bring the whole party, bring the whole package.
Yeah, he's one of the most intriguing prospects in the draft to me, where it's like there's so much unknown with him still, and still so much like potential to be kind of untapped.
Yeah.
But when we look at his teammate, Josh Simmons, the guy who he stepped in for, um, what are you seeing? I was very excited about his movement, but I'm curious to hear your more educated, better knowledge opinion of what you saw, and potentially some thoughts on the injury.
Yeah. So I want to start this by saying there's a couple people we'll talk about that for this exercise. I don't think these guys aren't going to be bad or anything. And I just think there's some potential movement issues, musculoskeletal based limitations that concern me. So over the first month of the season, right, Josh Simmons was easily an option to be offensive tackle one in this class, just depending on your flavor and what you thought. He had a non-contact knee injury leading to a patellar tendon rupture. I think his upper body strength is a bit average, and he needs to rely heavily on his lower extremities because he's a very athletic dude. You see that on tape; it jumps out at you. I always get concerned when your calling card has something happen where you might get docked, right? Like if you are known as the athletic tackle, the fancy footed hippo, and now you have this patellar tendon rupture, which tends to happen through eccentric load. So eccentric load is lengthening, right? So if your when your knee is bending, that's your quad eccentrically loading. And it's usually a deceleration process, slowing things down so you can properly absorb force. And so, especially for him, if with it being an eccentric load, non-contact that caused that patellar tendon rupture, to me, that speaks to there was an imbalance within that system. And also, let's be real, sports are sports, football is football, and things happen. But I mean, he's a young dude. Usually you see these quad patellar tendon ruptures happen in, middle to older players. So it's a little odd it happened to him. So to me, that's why it screams like there's an imbalance that is there. And it's almost like has too much like a mobility and athleticism for his own good, right? It's just like, like a wild squid in a pony ride. You just can't even wrangle it in. And that's one of the reasons why I think potentially this injury happened in the first place. And then because he does have that upper, like average, I would say upper body strength, where does that continue to translate? What does that rehab look like for him? And, did he lose a little bit? Because even if you lose half a step, is that enough to lose what made you special?
Right. Like I was watching Brandon Thorne's tape breakdown with him earlier today, and it was like the guy was the guy was do it became very clear that he watches a lot of tape of the greats and replicates them. He was doing Trent Williams things on college kids because he's capable of doing that But
Yeah.
like you said, will he be able to do that after the injury? After if there's a quarter step lost, a half step lost, like in any given Sunday, it's a game of inches, right? Like you lose an inch, it matters. So that's interesting. Now, what does a patellar tendon? Because I thought it was an ACL this whole time. I hadn't dug too much into the injury. What does the recovery for that look like, and what's kind of the likelihood of a guy being able to bounce back fully from that? If you can put a number on it or
Sure.
describe it.
The thing that's odd, so I'll put a little asterisk on this again, is that a lot of times you see this, it is in a guy that's been in the league for 5 years. He's a late 20s, early 30-year-old, something like that. You don't see it a lot in college guys. You just don't. A full return typically takes somewhere between 6 months to a year. And players who return to play only recover to baseline with respect to like number of games played, often 2 to 3 years after the surgery. And players who returned to play had worse career length after surgery compared with other injuries. So it's a funky one. It's hard because again, the data doesn't necessarily look at what a college guy has to do with this because it just doesn't happen that often. So if you're looking to draft this guy, it's not the same as like the Karan Amagaji stuff because Karan had, he's a Yale guy and, there is a slight difference between quad and patellar rupture, yada,
Well,
yada, yada.
that's what I was about to ask about because I didn't remember exactly what Karan's was, but I remembered it was something more serious, and I wondered how that compared.
So yeah, Karan's was quad tendon rupture. So that's like the tendon that feeds into the top of your kneecap versus the patellar tendon, which is what Josh had, is the part at the bottom of the kneecap that connects to the lower leg bone. So, they're similar but different. One's bone to bone, one's muscle to bone. So, some of the return and all that is similar. At the end of the day, they both have to take a large amount of force into them. And the thing that sucks after any knee surgery at all is that you get a lot of quad atrophy. Now you can attenuate that if you do things properly, like blood flow restriction training, and as long as you're working with the right people, which I'm hoping and assuming that he is, you can really help with that. But a lot of times you're not getting that same force output in that quad until potentially 2 years post-op. So that's why a lot of you see these delayed recoveries where, he may redshirt his first year. It's hard to know. Are you okay with that? If he does redshirt in his second year, if he's at 80%, is that 80% enough for him? Right. And then depending on left versus right, sliding to your left to try to block that edge versus on the right side, right? You're loading differently onto those two legs. We talked about that earlier in the show about what that symmetry looks like. So it's a lot. If a team bets on him, let's say he falls further than he should based on what his tape was, you might get a home run. But at the same time, maybe you get a guy that's a little slow to recover, that you have a couple peak years, and then there's a relatively high re-injury rate too. So that's a risk you're willing to take for a, potentially, let's say, mid-ish first round pick.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of the linebacker at Notre Dame years ago. Jalen Smith? Was it? Yeah, Jalen Smith and like Miles Jack were taking like 33, 34. It was like that they fell because of those injuries that it was like you didn't know what their career was going to look like quite after that. As you're saying it, that's what it reminds me of. I'm not sure where he's going to end up in there, but it seems like that might be a tough risk to actually stomach at number 10.
Yeah, especially specifically for the Bears, where whoever you're taking at number 10 or whatever pick you take in the first round, wherever you're at, you need this guy to be a, prolonged starter for you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's got down the road all pro potential, not like they has to have multiple all pros, but I just have a hard time just balancing that at this point in time, especially with just kind of where this team's at.
Now, the last guy that we're going to talk about, offensive tackle, offensive guard, Kelvin Banks. And you and I have talked a little bit off air about him, but tell me your thoughts on Kelvin Banks. And I haven't gotten the chance to review the film again since we last talked about it, but I want to hear again kind of what's going on there and what your thoughts are.
This man pisses me off. And I say that because he has well-timed feet and handwork. He's biomechanically, he's sound. He allows him to attack, leverage, bend, and create force. But he can't stay on his damn feet. And his balance can be so easily disrupted, especially in the run game, which leaves him overextended or on the ground. And I think part of that, he lacks the kind of desired thickness you want in his limbs when you compare it to some of his compatriots. And in this draft. His pass protection features a lot of excessive forward lean. So is that a poor lower extremity power issue? Is it a core stability issue? Is it a subclinical vestibular issue? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff it could be in terms of why the heck he ends up on the ground so much. But, he's athletic as hell, and it's everything. If you just took random snapshots from him, it's like this is exactly what you would want out of a potentially tackle, maybe even someone who can slide into guard. But the body control thing can get away from him in protection and on the run game. And so it's like, is this something that we can address and improve, or is this just a little bit of him? And that's hard to say unless you really know the guy, or maybe do what the Bears did with Darnell Wright, where you say, hey, we can get our hands on you and put you through a workout where we can see exactly where some of these limitations might be.
Right. And I think that's something that personally I hope that they do, because I'm not sitting here trying to sell Kelvin Banks at number 10. If they want Kelvin Banks and they can trade down, that makes sense to me. But if not, it's tough to make that fit at 10. But that game against Georgia, I just cannot get it out of my head. That man was just kicking everyone's ass, and those are grown men on that Georgia defensive line. Like, he was just beating people up, and that is hard to get out of my head. Now, we were talking about the balance issues. You named off a few. Do you think all of those are workable things, or are there different things that are easier to work with than others as far as making some of it right?
No, 100%. So, if it's, for example, I talked about a lower extremity power issue, that one's a little harder to work with because sometimes you're just built different. Different types of frames can hold different amounts of like muscle mass, for example. I just think he's got some smaller legs than I would expect for someone of his size. And with that, so it's like, does he have the bone density of the femurs and of the innominates, those hip bones, to really hold enough muscle to be able to generate the force? Because for anything upper body wise, and that's everything from a pitcher to a swimmer to, let's say, to an offensive lineman who's blocking, you need at least 50% in an efficient system of the force to come from the lower extremities. So if you're having to borrow some of that from extra core work, extra extremity work, you're already working at a disadvantage. Now, if it's core stability, yeah, I mean, you could work the hell out of that. I mean, that's just going to be, a lot of traditional tying the upper into lower and vice versa. People talk about Pilates all the time. I think it's fantastic. Pilates is great. I mean, it just has to be a part of your whole system. You can't be the end all be all, things of that nature. And I mentioned like subclinical vestibular. So that's really a combination of, you don't have a true vestibular issue. So it's not like you have BPPV. It's not like you have, something like a true vertigo, but it's like the way that your eyes, inner ear, and neck all work together just are slightly off enough where instead of being in place A in the world, your body thinks you're in place B in the world. And even if it only thinks you're a couple millimeters off, everything just kind of shifts that way. And now all of a sudden, like, your output's just not the same. So, I mean, just really, really quick example. I had this collegiate football player, wide receiver, and he had this, and his came from, it was a concussion, like 2 of them 5 years prior. And he got cleared. Everything was fine. He wasn't having headaches or any of this stuff. Literally, he came in just being like, I keep spraining my ankle. I don't know why. And also, I just kind of feel off. And we tied it to some head, neck stuff, some eye stuff. We worked on all that. And that actually, I talked to him about a couple weeks ago. He hasn't sprained an ankle since. So it's crazy how, I mean, the body's literally all connected. And so it could be something like that. So yeah, there's different degrees of things you can work on.
And folks, this is why you got to listen to Mason's podcast, Bare Bones, because it's the only place you're going to talk about the inner ear and how it works on a football field. But Mason, before we get into edge rushers, we have a comment in here from Bear Truth 9 asking about Chase Young and his injury. Do you know anything about Chase Young's injury? I'm kind of throwing this at you in the dark. So if you don't, no big deal, but I wanted to ask it.
Yeah, I mean, he had the neck surgery like in way before, if that was the one that we talked about, and then that was coming off of also then like a neck stinger back in 2023, if I recall correctly. If that's what they're talking about, I mean, there wasn't anything necessarily during the season that I saw that was problematic. It wasn't, or at least anything obvious. I mean, anytime you deal with neck stuff, it's a cause for concern, but it didn't seem like anything recurrent. I I mean, if he's going back to the ACL stuff, and I've talked about that on Bare Bones, a couple other shows. I mean, the ACL tear was a crazy, super involved, a lot of things going on. But again, he's far enough out from it, and also we haven't really seen enough issue with it that at least, it's not very obvious that it's affecting his play. Now, I think some of his stats last year, a little bit was empty. So like some empty sacks, some secondary pressure. There, yeah, the knee. Some secondary pressure stuff that like he got it because he lost contain and then had to go get the quarterback anyway. Things like that. So I'm not worried about the knee as much. I just think if anything, probably what you're getting for the amount you're having to pay, just because it's Chase Young, it's a name, is probably a little more than what you want for he needs to be edge 2. And right now, at least what you have data-wise from Montez Sweat is that he's kind of an edge 2 plus, maybe 1 minus. He's in this weird kind of middle group.
Right.
So do you really want to pay that much for an edge 2? I don't know.
It's a valid question, but let's get back to our draft prospects. And actually, before we get into edges, I skipped our first group, which was we had one running back we wanted to talk about. And
my man,
you pronounce his name because I do not know. I have not looked up the phonetic spelling, and I am at a loss.
Here's the thing. I haven't looked it up either, but my best guess, because honestly, I just watched tape and it's usually sound off. So I have no idea. I'm going to say Bhayshul Tuten. That's what I'm saying for now, and I'll fix it maybe later. But
and if his
awesome.
Nickname isn't King Tut, there's something wrong. But
it absolutely should be.
Yeah, but what do you see with Tuten on what? Yeah, Tuten. What do you see on his tape with his body movement?
So when it comes to like running back in general, one of the things is there's the obvious stuff, just like how fast are you, how good are you able to cut, things like that. But even more importantly, at least for me, is how do you combine your speed and strength and in what frame? So for him, right, he's like 5'11", 208, and so he's not a big guy, right? Last offseason, he ran a 4.32 40, 23.1 miles per hour max velocity, benched 400 pounds, and had a vertical jump of 39 inches. He's a rare track speed that makes him a threat to score on any snap. And in 2024, he actually was tied for third in the nation with 4 runs of 50-plus yards. He's a walking highlight reel kind of a thing. So for him, it's all about movement patterns. So ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, right? One of the big things I look at with running backs is, do you tape your ankle or wear a brace? It's actually been shown that if you tape or brace, you're exponentially more likely to put stress on your knee. And now all of a sudden, right, you're having conversations, MCL, ACL, all that jazz. And it's also just going to limit what you can do cut-wise, right? And you're just not going to be able to get as much depth if you have a heavily taped ankle. So that's part of it. Can you create, I always call it like the crossover like position. So if you go back and watch Allen Iverson highlights, he's able to get that tibia, that lower leg bone pretty basically parallel with the ground. Can you get that deep into a cut, or are you like an upright cutter, right? Where a lot of it is coming from torsion at the upper body through the core, having to drop your hip, things of that nature. Core strength is important, but does that strength carry over 3 dimensions, right? Trunk dissociation. So we talked about this a little bit when it came to tackles, but also with running back, can your lower body be heading one direction and then you're able to contort the upper to slip through a hole heading the other? And I think he in particular can do all of those things. I know for him, there's some worry about his size because he just runs really angry, but his frame doesn't necessarily support it. So can you reel him back a little bit on that? But just in terms of, his slip ability, right? Because he can really find the hole pretty well. He might be a little late to it. His decision making is a little funky, but in terms of once he finds the hole, how he gets through it, and he is a force. Like you will see him run through a linebacker's chest as well. So he's one of my favorite late round running backs that just has all the movement things I just talked about that I really like in running back.
Now, how would you define, this isn't anything specific to Tuten because I haven't actually watched much of him yet, but one thing that I always struggle with running backs is how much emphasis can and should I put on being explosive in their jump cuts and their ability to get lateral kind of quickly. And like, how would you define that within a running back, how you value it and what you think, I feel like it's very different from college to the NFL with most runners' ability to do this. And like, how do you weigh that?
I think it's really important because at the end of the day, two things. One, the less hits you can take as an NFL running back, the better. So if you can get, 6 yards in a jump cut that cuts your time in half instead of having to take, an extra step or two in between, that's going to be less likely to get hit because you're getting through the hole faster. But also B, it's much more efficient that way. Also, too, to an extent, it's going to show improved vision on this. But you're going to look at things like, your 3-cone drill, your broad jump. I wish there was a couple other things that they did at the NFL Combine, to be honest. I think we're missing some meat on the bone of some testing that we could do. But those are some things that you can see just to see what that explosiveness looks like. And it's not just how far do you jump cut. It's how far do you jump cut and then get out of that cut to the next cut, whether it's, cutting back or heading forward. There's a test that we do using these things called force decks. They're basically just force plates that measure velocity, amplitude, and all that stuff for jumping. One of the measures we look at is something called RSI. And what it is, at least I think, is a measure of athleticism. So basically, how quickly can you generate a lot of force? Because it's fine if you sit there for a whole second and can create a lot of force. That's great and all, but I'd rather take the person who can create the same amount of force in half the time.
Right.
So as soon as you make that jump cut, what does that next step look like? Are you able to produce the same force now forward or laterally, not just how well can you move to the side?
Okay. Interesting. And like I've noticed a handful of upright runners so far this year who I think, they have some pretty solid jump cuts actually. And they land and they get moving forward really quick. But I'm almost sitting here wondering, talking with you, how much their upright running has to do with their lower body flexibility and ability to really bend the lower half, and whether, that upright running ability is really they're going to pay more in the NFL for that.
I think there's almost two parts of that conversation. The first one being exactly like you said. I mean, the more upright you are, just the bigger target you are. So you're inherently, you're just the more likely to take hits. But there is something to be said about an individual that has the explosiveness in the joints, the ligament itself, that they don't need to sink, right? Like, so it's more of a, can you sink or are you choosing not to sink, right? Because if it's more of a can't, that sucks. Like, you want options. The fact that you don't have that option is bad. If you choose not to sink because you can get the same amount of power, speed, agility, movement pattern with less time in your drop, in your sink, that's an advantage, right? Because now that's cutting time down. That's using more, again, like of a quick spring ligament load than it is like true muscular. So that's also going to save you energy and really fatigability over the course of your game.
Okay, interesting. Now, I want to get into edge rushers here, and we'll start off with, the first name on our list is Abdul Carter, but I know you want to talk about Mike Green, so let's start off with Mike Green.
My guy, Mighty Mouse. That's what I've been calling him. I am also kind of annoyed because, I've had a couple of sleepers that have hit over the last couple of years I've been doing this, and I thought Mike Green was going to be one of them, and then he blew up, and so now it's like, cool, no longer a sleeper. Everyone loves Mike Green. But 6'3" dude, 251 pounds. He's 8 pounds heavier this year than last year. So, he's showing he can put weight on. That was one of his biggest issues. I would say stop worrying about his size and what you feel is a prototype edge for your defense. Not talking to anyone specifically, but kind of am. The question is, can he win one-on-ones? And he does so with speed and violence, which generates power. Right? It's physics. Force is mass times acceleration. So if you can either increase mass or increase acceleration, you're going to increase force. His acceleration is so good that it makes up for his lack of mass. He creates separation not with length, but with pop. He can, even if you get a handout, he can hit you hard enough that he generates space anyway. He reminds me of a less powerful but more athletic Will Anderson. I also love, and this is just me, the fact that he was a wrestler and a high-level wrestler. So that mat background manifests in his leverage and hand fighting. Just explosive as hell. I mean, everyone saw that one-on-one bull rush rep he had against 313-pound Josh Connerly. he's going to light up the combine. I mean, he's got a chance to run like low 4.5s in the 40, but I mean, I'm super excited to see what his 10-yard split is, because you're just not going to beat this guy with power. His core is just strong enough that you won't see him twisted, bent over backwards. You have a hard time stopping him consistently because of his motor and because of that power that he can generate from that compact frame.
Now, you mentioned his pop in his hands. How teachable is that? How trainable is that? Or is that, I wonder this myself. I see a guy who has heavy hands, but they're slow, or a guy who has fast hands, but they don't impact anything. Like how much of that is learnable and trainable for your body?
There's a lot that's just kind of who you are. I think for him, the amount of pop he has is just a little bit of him, but you can definitely, improve it to an extent. So like hand speed, for example, I mean, that's very trainable, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do it, just in terms of how quickly you can latch, unlatch, just in reaction time. The heavy hand part, that's where it gets a little funkier, because where's your force coming from? Some people, like I think with Green, he just naturally has that lower into upper body acceleration into the hands, versus some people tried to just like throw their hands, and now they're trying to like throw it with the shoulder, with the core. And so that's where it gets kind of
Dexter's
long.
a great example. I don't think his hands are ever going to be quick. They're just cement blocks.
There's lumbering hands, right? So you can do it, right? So there's ways to get around it, but yeah, there's just some people are naturally faster, some people are naturally heavier, and some people can kind of do a nice little blend of both, and Green's one of them.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Abdul Carter and his body mechanics, because I'm sure there's some fun stuff going on there.
He's a guy, he doesn't have elite size, right? He's 6'3", 254 pounds about, I think. But his explosiveness is special. Now it's different from Green. Like Green is explosive into power, versus Abdul Carter is just explosive into like just burst fastness, right? It's a different kind. So his first step is freakish. Like it just jumps off the tape, consistently beating tackles to their spot. Like the ball is snapped, and his stride, he's able to take a step in a way where he's in that center of gravity of the tackle before they're really even ready for it. And you saw him clock last offseason with a 4.48 40, along with a 4.35 shuttle and a pretty impressive 10.7 broad jump. And his vertical jump, it was 33.5 inches. So it's just the way he sets the tempo, like the way he initiates contact, disengages in a way where he dictates the confrontation. And he just does that because he's just so dang twitchy. And the fact you throw in, you talked about this way at the beginning of the show, the bend that he has, the way that he can flatten the top of his rush or hit a game-breaking spin counter inside. I mean, that's a whole other thing too, in terms of the balance and control to be able to, on a dime, stop and rotate the other direction.
And is that how you would define bend, or what do you see as bend being? I find this to be a very interesting topic to ask people.
People just throw bend around. It's like, oh, he's got great or terrible bend, and you ask like, what do you mean? It's like, I don't know, he's bendy.
It's like it changes by each position too. Bend for an offensive tackle is different than bend for an edge rusher, which they're going against each other. You'd think they'd be the same thing.
So I think for edges in particular, right, you can get bend through multiple parts in that biomechanics system. So it's a combination of ankle all the way through really the upper back, thoracic spine, even neck to an extent. So how well do you, because I think what Carter does, he's got really good lateral ankle bend. So, thinking about, let's go back to that basketball analogy, the crossover, right? The foot is planted, but the person's body is way over to the side, right? That you can so medially or inwardly. But what I don't think he's got is great forward bend. So traditional ankle bend up and down. So that's going to be a little bit more maybe like what you'll see with the tackle. In terms of what's happening at like the hip, dropping and being able to rotate that hip or pelvis downward or upward. We talked about that a little bit earlier too. And then, of course, also rotation at the spine. Now, I mentioned the neck because at the end of the day, right, when you're that edge rusher, you have to be able to get your head around and get, to that quarterback. Mm-hmm. So you'll see some guys just don't have the ability to have upper back rotated. Maybe let's say you're a left edge rusher, rotated to the left, head rotated to the right, so that ultimately you can still keep your center, your eye on where that spot's going to be. And so you'll see the body follows the eyes and the neck. Mm-hmm. So if you can't get your head around far enough to the right, now your body will start to float upfield more versus a guy like Carter, he's able to rotate all as much further into that drop low, up and under, and continue to that one spot, right? In the backfield.
Man, that is an interesting way to look at it. The you go where your eyes tell you to go, right?
Yeah.
Like your eyes go to your brain, and your brain goes to where they see you need to go. Your ability to keep your eyes on the quarterback is really key. I've never thought about it that way. That's interesting. That's a good point.
Yeah, and you see some guys who just aren't quite as good at it. I have to dive a little deeper. Maybe he's one example. Anyway, but it's individuals who maybe they get in like the general fray, but they don't finish well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, where was the whole eye, neck, shoulder situation? Because if
Yeah.
that wasn't where you needed to be, I mean, you're just kind of be flopping in the air and hoping for the best.
Well, I'm thinking about a guy specifically, Derek Hall, a few years ago out of Auburn. The guy didn't have very good actual like neck back mobility. He was a menace, always getting pressure, but he didn't finish almost at all in college. And he actually turned into more of a power rusher in the NFL and has done so. He did some good stuff this past year, but it makes sense that he became more of a power rusher when he's not winning that edge and being able to see his target and actually go finish.
Hey, who'd have thunk it, right? You got to be able to see what you're going after.
Yeah. Now we got 3 more guys here, and we have let's see about 10 minutes. So I'll let you choose the order that you want to go in with them. So we got Princely Umanmielen. I forget how to pronounce it, but I mean I love his tape. But and then JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer.
We can actually go. I think that's a good order because I think for me it's like Princely's I'm kind of more in the positive, who I like, and then the other two are more like buyer beware in terms of some movement patterns. In terms of Princely, so he's Gumby, right? So he's not very strong, but he's the perfect example of what that bendability and what that really looks like. Because I mean, he can dissociate like no other. I mean, he could have his chest facing one way and his pelvis is the other, and his knees almost on the ground. I mean, he's just as like floppy around. You add that he's got some pretty elite speed as well with that. He's gotten a bit bigger and stronger, which has helped him against the run in the last year. But he's also a senior, so I think he's pretty much filled out to where he's going to be. I mean, there's still a difference between college and NFL weight training programs. So you might be able to add a little bit, but I think kind of like the general framework of his body is what it is. So I don't think he's ever really going to be a great run defender, but maybe a team just wants that. They just want a guy that's going to be more slippy and be able to try to, create that pressure. But because he doesn't necessarily have the heft, this is probably the one negative I have for him is that will he be able to, against these bigger, longer tackles, consistently be able to actually get the sack, not just the pressure? Because I mean, he was pretty productive in college, but two different games.
I fell in love with his tape at Georgia last year. I was just like, this dude is not human. Like
Yeah.
the way he moves is just different than everyone else.
Well, just the way you get into blockers as well is important. Like, so everyone talks about leverage, but how you get into leverage is another thing. Like, he's like a really good knee bender where he can dip down, be on the tiptoes, power off, and go from that deep knee bend and explode around that corner. Versus a lot of other guys, like they create leverage just by just dropping, right? I mean, that's
Right.
then there's sort of difference between like the two.
Yeah. The kind of like loading up and springing out versus just like, well, I'm low. Coach says low man wins. Like now, how about JT Tuimoloau out of Ohio State? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on him, and largely because he is. I truly think he might be one of the best studied defensive players coming into the NFL in the draft, but I see the limits. So where are your thoughts there?
So to me, he just reads as kind of like rigid. So he creates a lot of lift and extension through his contact, and he's able to do a lot of stuff like short area agility. So within that small space, but if you ask him to do a lot of bend, if you ask him to do more almost like pursuit, I don't see just quite as much there. So that's a bit of my concern, is that he doesn't have as much of the flexibility that you want. He's got the power, he's got the strength that you want there. Right. It's just like how fluid is he in terms of being able to transition up and down the field?
Yeah, and that all makes sense. I think that all conveys on tape. Like I don't think anyone is hearing that going, that's surprising, right? Like that he's a limited mover. He's interesting to me though because he's going to be a true test of how much the mental side, how far they can get you in the NFL. I think paired with like good strength, like you said, but just his studying of his opponents in the game. From everything I've heard and read, and like Josh Simmons was talking about it with Brandon Thorne, he's like, yeah, if in practice, if I don't change my stance, JT's going to torch me all day. Like I need to be changing my stance constantly because he just studies this stuff. But what about his teammate, Jack Sawyer?
Oh, Jack. He's a one-dimensional pass rusher, and it lacks the ideal suddenness, length for an edge. It's below average get off. He plays with a super wide base that's pretty limiting his explosiveness. He lacks bend, stiff at the hips and the ankles. He's a high motor guy, with size and strength. He's got that bare, just smack you around kind of heavy hand, and he actually might test okay, but it just doesn't transfer functionally. You look at him, you're like, oh, you're a football player, you're an edge, but then you see him play and you're like, but you just, why are your joints made of glue? Like it's just so sticky, and I just want it to be, I want it more. And the 2 games I watched of his, I just was like, oh man, you're going to be in the NFL. You're going to be that guy that hops, I think, from team to team, and because you have the right mentality, and again, you have that high motor. But I just don't know that he's ever going to be like anything more than a dude.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you might test okay. What do you think about when you see a guy who tested really well, but the tape does not look the same as that testing? Where does your brain go when you see that?
2 main things. One being, we live in the day and age where the NFL Combine is a science, right? We know the answers to the test, and the agents know that, the trainers know that, the players know that. And so you can spend your time pretty much from whenever your season ends all the way through the combine perfecting and getting and using those answers to the test. So, that's, I think, a bit of a problem with how we look at things now, because and you can see that too, like a lot of the Notre Dame guys, right, skipped a Senior Bowl, and because they played for a long time, their bodies were worn down, but also because they had less time to prepare. So they just wanted to spend as much time as they could trying to shave, right, an extra 0.04 seconds off their 40 time, right, to add 5 more reps to their bench press, things like that. So that's part of the issue. The second one being, a lot of athletes have the prerequisite tools, but they just don't know or can't transfer them well onto the field, right? So they have the strength, but what stops the strength, the power, the agility from coming out? And sometimes it's as simple as, like, I think for example with Sawyer, like I just don't think he spends enough time working on that mobility. So if with his ankle and his hips being as limited as they are, there's just less opportunity, less ability for it to actually transfer out into his get off into the run. So, that's where, and this is kind of like, soapbox for all the high school and college athletes out there who are trying to, take what's going to separate me, is trying to pair yourself with individuals, trainers who are able to unlock that next step for you, because they look at that small bit. And I think that's what you're missing a lot when you see that guy, like, yeah, he can run super well in a straight line. In this little bit, this like 3-cone drill, right? He can cut well. His vertical is off the charts, but it just doesn't translate out onto the field.
Interesting. And that's because that's always something I struggle with, is finding that answer. Like Theo Johnson ran great last year, right? All the tests blew him out, like blew the doors off. But I couldn't shake that I thought he looked slow and unagile on tape. And it was just like, I know the numbers, I seen the tape. Where do I go from here? But Mason, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Can you let everyone know where they can find you, your work, your podcast, and where they should follow?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can always find our podcast, Bare Bones. We tend to go out live on Thursdays. In the off season, we're basically doing a bunch of mock draft kind of stuff. During the season, preview and post game show. So you can find that anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes. It'll be under the Second City Gridiron family. You can follow me on Twitter. You can see it here if you're watching live, but if not, at West Sports PT. I'm a physical therapist, clinic director of Ignite Physical Therapy and Sports Performance in the West Loop, specialized in athletes, but we do see everybody. So, if you are someone, you want us to play pickup basketball, or, maybe you got a kid, or you yourself are someone who is looking to get, into that professional sport world, we are here to help get that done for you.
All right. Well, Mason, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you, everybody, for listening, watching along with us, and as always, bear down.
Doodles.